Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon again. Thanks for your patience and flexibility. Our final interview today is with Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, who's someone I've gotten to know well and favorably over the last several months. For almost 25 years, Senator Bennet has proven to be a voice of reason, consensus building, and moderation. He's someone willing to buck the conventional wisdom from time to time to achieve better results, even when it's not necessarily that popular to do so. It's proven really, though, to be a winning combination, both in business and public service. And for those of you who may remember, or who may be from Colorado, you remember his reforms as superintendent of the Denver public school system, which fundamentally transformed that heretofore troubled system into a very successful operation. Now, Senator Bennet is working on a fully bipartisan basis to promote the Americas Act, which we've talked about before and we'll be talking about again this afternoon. It's an effort which we fully support to advance the regional trade and investment dialogue through enhanced supply chains and other initiatives. As I testified last May before the Senate Finance Committee, the Americas Act is strategic, timely, and creative. It's a thoughtful framework for sustained regional engagement. Senator Bennet, welcome back to the Council.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see everybody today.
Let's begin with the strategic importance of trade and investment in the Western Hemisphere for U.S. interests. What's your perspective on that?
My perspective is that it's never been more important than it is right now. You've heard people say that for 30 years. You've heard people say that. My dad worked in this building many, many years ago. I haven't been in the State Department for a long time, and they were saying it back then. I think we're at a moment in, at least in the U.S. history, when we've come to the realization that 50 years of outsourcing to Southeast Asia and to China has not benefited the American worker and has not benefited the American economy in the way that it might. Obviously, we're going to need to be integrated with Southeast Asia and with China, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but casting that as our most imaginative bet in terms of how we build our own economy turns out to not been all that useful, and COVID really revealed that. And the rise of Xi Jinping has really revealed it, and the decisions that Xi Jinping has made over the past several years that are quite unfriendly to business and unfriendly to the West in terms of our investments, I think creates this amazing moment for our hemisphere to decide that there is no way for us to compete effectively unless we work together and we collaborate together. When I'm at home, and I come from a purple state, we don't have that many of those left in America anymore, but mine still is. It's about a third Democratic, a third Republican, a third Independent. And when I say to people, can you imagine a world where maybe we could compete more effectively with our measly 330 million people if we take our two largest trade partners right now, Canada and Mexico, and we added to them Latin America? And it doesn't take a lot of imagination for people to say that makes a lot of sense to us. So I think there is a moment, and it's less about what the politicians here think than the people at home think. There's a moment, I think, for these kinds of policy changes, and I can describe a little bit what the bill does if people are interested in
Well,
that.
in fact, you're reading my mind because that's a great segue to the next question. But Senator,
I just said that so my answer would stop being so long-winded.
Well, it was an effective segue indeed. We had at a meeting previously this spring, we had Senator Bill Cassidy talking about these issues, and he was talking about the importance of bipartisanship on some of these issues. I think you've been a real proponent of that as well. Talk a little bit about the importance of that, but also then from the Americas Act perspective, what is it and why do we need it?
Well, I think we can't get anything done unless we do it in a bipartisan way, and that's important. And over the next month, you're going to see whether what I'm saying is true or not. There are people over there on Capitol Hill right now who believe, this is off topic, so I apologize, who believe that the United States is going to cut off our support for Ukraine. And it's my view that the Ukrainians are quite close to winning on the battlefield, and that Putin is counting on the battlefield of Capitol Hill to be the battlefield he wins. That's what he believes. And we have to show him that that's not true. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is in a bipartisan way. It's the same thing with this kind of effort. we can't, if I could just speak for the United States, there's too much dependent on our leadership in the region or the hemisphere for it to depend on who's the president of the United States. And we can't have a situation where you get one president elected and they do a bunch of stuff, someone else gets elected, they do a bunch of stuff, and you can't actually make enduring policy change in the region. And so I think if we could pass the Americas Act, what we would see is the current, 11 or so or 12, if you include USMCA, trade agreements in the region begin to function more as a web and less as kind of, as Bill says, a hub and spoke apparatus. You'd be able to see, I think, more imaginative and more creative equity and debt financing to be able to align better with those changing trades. You'd see more countries become part of the USMCA, and I think you'd also have a lot more cultural back and forth among the countries that we're dealing with. So that's my hope for it. I think what we're doing is entirely consistent with the president's initiative that he's working on in the Americas. But I think it really matters if Congress concretizes something like this. We can't just leave it to administration.
You're talking about the APEP, the
Exactly.
America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Yeah, and you see the
I
two.
couldn't remember the name, so thank
APEP,
you.
it just
Yeah.
kind of. And you see the two initiatives as
Completely aligned. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you talking to the White House about those?
We are, and we've had a very good reaction. Our bill is still in process, and they're weighing in with some suggestions about how to change it, which will be good, because I think it'd be good to have the administration and Congress on the same page.
Yeah, both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to pick up on a comment you made in terms of the bipartisanship issue and the nature of going from administration to administration where policy sometimes shifts back and forth. U.S. is going into an election year in 2024. It's going to be complicated. It will have an impact on Latin America, even if Latin America itself isn't necessarily the topic of discussion. Can you help us think those issues through? I mean, how should our Latin American friends be looking at the U.S. election season as we get things heated up?
Well, I'm looking at it with worry. No, I'm just kidding. I think that I think that we have a lot of challenges that we confront, that we need to confront, that we need to be honest about too. Drug smuggling, human smuggling, the border. And I think these are issues that we can address, as I think we're addressing them now, from a position of weakness and not from a spirit of collaboration, or we can address them in a collaborative way that will give us strength to actually deal with them. And I would hope that we would have two candidates for president running in this cycle who would have a vision for what this hemisphere ought to look like, for how together we could compete much more effectively with China, how together we could deal with the migration issues rather than by saying we're going to send the U.S. Army over to clear this up, that we might actually have a thoughtful partnership with Mexico and others to be able to deal with what has become a crisis on the southern border of the United States. That is talking about what we do to stop the lethal fentanyl that's coming north, and what we do to stop the guns that are going south. And the reason we all ought to do this is not because we want to spend all our time working on those kinds of issues. It's because it's a pathway, I think, to getting to the economic collaboration that we need. I think from the perspective, every day that I live longer on this planet, I come to realize what a treasure democracy actually is. Like, even with how screwed up our own Congress is and the inability to get a Speaker of the House for a month, the ridiculous role that money plays in our elections. I could go on forever, the partisan stuff, all that stuff. I believe more in democracy today than I did when I got here to Washington. And that's not because we've solved the world's problems, but I can see what's happening in other countries around the world that don't even have the promise of democracy in front of them. And my wish, I guess, for our region would be that we would have this as an opportunity for us to mutually strengthen our commitment to democracy, our commitment to the rule of law, our commitment to civil liberties and to human rights, and to those freedoms that are so different than what's on offer from Xi Jinping or what's on offer from Putin. And maybe the United States is in a little bit of a more humble place at the moment because we have seen just at how at risk our own democracy can be because of, among other things, what happened on January 6th. You know, and maybe this is an opportunity for us to double down in the region, not as somebody who's telling everybody else what to do, but as somebody who has maybe better resources than some other folks do, to see if we can strengthen these critical ingredients to living a better life. Because that is the competition that we're facing right now, and the United States is going to have to show up. So my hope would be that if we were living in a rational world, we would have a Republican presidential candidate and a Democratic presidential candidate who would say the stuff that I just said, because I think it actually matters to the people that I represent, who are a third Republican, a third Democratic, and a third unaffiliated. That's what they want to hear.
Let's talk about that a little bit. The people of Colorado. Colorado has a long history.
The best state. Yeah, thanks for getting to that. I mean, this is a nice place. It's not.
Denver ain't bad.
The Rocky Mountains. Yeah.
Colorado obviously has a long history with the region. Colorado, the name is actually, you know, of course. But agriculture, energy, mining. The question is, based on what you just said, do the folks in your state necessarily see some of the opportunities? We talk a lot about, you know, some of the challenges and problems, borders, migration, et cetera, which are all very real. But one of the things we've been talking about a lot today has been some of the opportunities inherent in the Western Hemisphere that are sometimes overlooked. Is this an area where further conversation might be able to engender greater appreciation in terms of the importance of the region for U.S. interests?
I mean, I think further conversation will help. It always does help. Yeah. But I guess what I want to leave you with today, and you can check and see in the end if I'm wrong, I think we're pushing on open door. I think people in my town halls understand something about what's gone wrong with the policies that we had that I mentioned earlier that started, I'm not making a partisan observation, it's temporal observation, started about the time Ronald Reagan was president. And, you know, have lasted for about that 40 or 50 years. Some people call it neoliberalism, some people call it, you know, other things. But the reality of it is, for those of us that were raised on that sort of economic theory, and I grew up at that time, went to college and law school at that time, you know, what we were not grappling with was the idea that we were not engaged in free trade, and we were not engaged in, you know, what we would think of as capitalism, and that Beijing was engaged in a form of state-sponsored capitalism, you know, which was a very successful China First policy, very successful from their point of view, but not that successful from our point of view. And as much as I disagree with Donald Trump about virtually everything, I do think he had a preternatural sense of that, of the promises that had been made turning out not to be true. So then the question becomes, what do we do about that? And one answer could be we're going to be isolationists and we're going to make America great. That might be one answer. Another answer is that we might have this integrated economy that I've been talking about, and I believe people in Colorado want that, and it is part of our heritage. I mean, we're called Colorado because we were part of the Spanish Empire. We were obviously part of Mexico, and there are people living there who still say that the United States closed over them, that they were there before there was a border there, and one of those people is Ken Salazar, who's my predecessor in this job, who I just visited 3 weeks ago in Mexico City, who's our ambassador to Mexico. We're very proud that Ken Salazar is there, and he's happy to have the opportunity to be able to demonstrate that he's from a place called San Luis, in the San Luis Valley, next to Alamosa. You know, all the towns in that part of Colorado are Spanish names. All the rivers are Spanish names, and there is a closeness here that we've got to figure out a way to build on. One of the reasons why I'm not just active on the stuff with Bill, but also on immigration issues, and I have been for so long, the failed Gang of Eight bill in 2013 that got 68 votes in the Senate never got a vote in the House of Representatives, is that the current state of affairs is completely at war with who people in Colorado think, we all ought to be, which is a region that's actually collaborating and working together and getting things done. On very simple, some of it is, can we sell our energy effectively to Mexico? That's a question people in Colorado are asking. And when I was in Mexico City, I was saying to people, we would like to enforce our view of what the U.S. SMCA does in a way that's consistent with, but some of it is just people would like to be able to go home and visit their relatives in Mexico. But they can't because they can't figure out a way to get right with the law in the United States because of their legal status, and we haven't been able to fix it. And they can't figure out how to go home without without the risk of not coming back. And just from the daily, sort of strain of human beings, that's a terrible position for people to be in. But I can tell you, it's not good for our economy. I mean, we'd be a lot better off if people were able to move back and forth as we envisioned in the Gang of Eight bill and do the work they want to do here and go home and see their family and then come back, or vice versa. I think we can do all of that if we have a very high set of expectations for what our political system ought to deliver. If we're going to continue to have the rather pathetic expectations that we've had, then, who knows what's going to happen.
The whole circularity issue of migratory patterns. Yeah. We don't have a lot of time left, probably about 7 or 8 minutes. I want to open the aperture a little bit wider on trade, not specifically trade with Latin America and the hemisphere, but trade generally. It seems to be almost a 4-letter word these days in Washington, both Republicans and Democrats. And, all morning we've been hearing from folks like the head of the IMF and, even the director of national intelligence, but others as well, talking about the importance of trade and expanding trade in the region with itself and with the United States. And ultimately, these are domestic issues in Washington. And I guess the question is, from your perspective, how do we begin to change that dynamic so that people begin to see the opportunities in trade and not the idea that it's, everything about trade is bad and negative and we should do less of it?
Let me enter this question with what will sound like a totally random segue, which is the latest thing that people want to talk about is artificial intelligence. Because it's coming, and what are you going to do? And some people are saying this is going to be the greatest thing that ever happened. Other people are going to say we're going to blow up the planet. One thing, I don't know. I don't know what we'll do. I have high hopes. You mentioned that I've been the superintendent of schools. I have high hopes that maybe all over the planet, children will benefit from having artificial intelligence as part of how they learn. And but what I do know is if Beijing is able to develop their model of AI that consistent with their totalitarian society, consistent with their view of an absence of rule of law, consistent with the surveillance state that Beijing has been able to establish with tools, including social media and now AI, that George Orwell could never have imagined, that's going to be a bad planet for us to live in. If we develop AI in a way that's consistent with our values and consistent with our approach to the rule of law, and consistent with the freedoms that we all say we subscribe to, that's going to be a better planet. We're never going to have a say on that if we decide that we're just going to go it alone. And the best way for us to avoid going it alone is to build the kind of trade relations that you're talking about. We won't succeed, you're right. It's a 4-letter word if it's trade arrangements that are not going to be good for the American worker, if it's trade arrangements that aren't going to be good for our economy. The American people have had enough of that, and justifiably so, and that's why you see the bipartisan resistance to it. But I think the right way to start this is in our own hemisphere, and to observe the fact that we've already got those 11 unilateral trade agreements that, if we could pass the Americas Act, could work together more like a web. If you had a set of rules that were coherent and overlapping that allowed people to trade not just between the United States and a Latin American country, but among the countries that were part of that. If you had an expanded USMCA to be able to do that, and you had the kind of financing mechanisms we imagine, that Bill and I imagine in this bill, I think pretty quickly you'd be able to see things beginning to change. And you'd be able to say to people, you want an answer for the migration issues in the region? There's nothing more significant than a policy that creates economic growth in Latin America, because that is the way to solve, in the long run, that's the way to solve the migration problem. So I think there is just huge opportunity here. You'll always have naysayers. You always have people who say it can't be done. The American people are ready for this. And as I said the other day somewhere, if we fail, it's just going to be a failure of our lack of imagination. The public is where we need the public to be.
As we begin to think about wrapping up our conversation, from the Senate perspective, how can the private sector, the business community, help in centering Latin America in terms of the broader conversations?
There's no point in doing it if we can't get the private sector to lead here. There's just no point. I remember, one of the low points. I don't know. It's a diary with many low. One of the low points that I can remember in my Senate career was sitting in my office, and I would bet that it was 2010. And there was a official from one of the most well-known manufacturing companies in America. And all these years later, I'm not going to tell you who it was because he told me I couldn't repeat who it was. And he said to me, Michael, we're in China, but they're stealing our IP. Every day they're stealing our IP. And that's outrageous. But don't say anything about it, because if you say anything about it, they will throw us out of China. That's an example of the kind of trade that we made that made absolutely no sense. And you'll remember it from back then. The trade was that we're going to get the customer base, and so we're going to be willing to give up the IP protections. It turns out that having a commitment to the rule of law, to an international regime of IP protections and those kinds of things is really, really important to making this work. All these years later, to come back to your question, which I was forgetting, but I now have remembered, all these years later, you are seeing a private sector reduction of our investment in China by 80% in the last 2 years. 80%. That investment has to go somewhere. So why wouldn't it go in this hemisphere? Why wouldn't we build on our the largest trading partners that we already have? We already have the USMCA. We don't even have to, and that, by the way, is a modern day trade agreement that got broad bipartisan support. It's not one of the ones that, gained the ire of people on both sides of the aisle. We have the other trading agreements that we can bring together in a more harmonious way. So I just don't think there's a better. And by the way, just one last thought on energy. We're in this very odd moment where the Europeans are complaining about the Inflation Reduction Act because they're saying we put stuff in there that's made the United States compete unfairly or unlevel the playing field. And we should have that debate. We should have that discussion. And we should treat trade fairly. We definitely should. But I can't tell you what a relief it is to hear somebody saying that we're actually ahead for once rather than being behind. And I think that as a hemisphere, when you think about the opportunities of what this global transition is going to look like on energy, there is no nation in the world better situated than the U.S. to lead on this. The only thing that would make us better situated than we are today is if we had a broad partnership that started with those two trading partners right next door to us and extended to the rest of Latin America.
It's a fabulous message. Thank you for bringing it and delivering it, and it's a great place to end. Senator Bennet, I mean this sincerely. I really want to thank you for your leadership on these issues. It's not easy to be necessarily pro-trade, speaking for Latin America, talking about opportunities. And it'll probably get more complicated as we go into an election year, but you've been consistent, you've been reasoned, And we really appreciate your voice. It's meaningful. And if we can do anything from the private sector perspective to... Yeah, I'm sure you will, but it's all good. And in addition, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our concluding speaker of the 2023 Washington Conference on the Americas, and now you see why we wanted him to conclude with the message that he's just left us with. This will, as I mentioned, conclude our program. I would ask three things of you before we depart. The first is, don't forget your gift bag. The second is, get ready to look for your emails and communications, because we're going to do this all over again in early May. And so I hope you'll join us then, I hope you'll support us again, and I hope you'll be with us at that time. And the third and final thing I would ask for all of you is to please join me in thanking Senator Bennet for his terrific comments.